Mr. President.
The minority leader's recognized.
Thank you. And first, let me thank my friend and colleague, the senior senator from Minnesota, for her eloquent, passionate words that tell the story of how she has done so much good and is working so hard to heal the wounds of Minnesota. We all appreciate it, Minnesotans and Americans. Thank you. Now, Mr. President, last night, as peaceful citizens exercised their constitutional right to protest in Lafayette Park across from the White House, federal law enforcement officers were ordered to clear out the crowds with tear gas and rubber bullets so that President Trump could walk from the White House to a nearby church for a photo op. He did not enter the church. He did not offer words of prayer. The crowds were dispersed with force so that he could get his picture taken with a Bible that wasn't his, held upside down in front of a church he never asked to visit. I spoke at length about these events this morning. The aggressive use of force on law-abiding protesters was appalling. It was an abuse of presidential power. It may have been illegal, and it was certainly a violation of the constitutional rights of American citizens. The protesters, some of them children, many of them families, there in a public park to peacefully protest, were met with rubber bullets and tear gas. This has no place in American society or any democracy worthy of the name. The President must cease his behavior. The images from last night should disturb all of us and must be condemned by the United States Senate. They cannot go unanswered, lest the images from last night should disturb all of us and must be condemned by the United States Senate. They cannot go unanswered, lest the President be encouraged to do even greater abuse because he has no self-restraint. So in a few minutes, I will ask the Senate's consent to pass a simple resolution that says three things. First, that the constitutional rights of Americans must be respected. Second, that violence and looting are unlawful and unacceptable. And third, that Congress condemns the order to have federal officers use gas and rubber bullets on peaceful protesters. This resolution is not a substitute for critical law enforcement and racial justice reforms that are badly needed. But this unconstitutional action by this lawless president requires a response from this body. I hope all senators will support this resolution. Democrats are outraged. Republicans should be outraged as well. For my friends on the other side who claim they have not seen the events of last night, I suggest you find a moment and turn on the television. Our Republican colleagues cannot be objecting to our resolution on the false grounds that it doesn't reject violence. It does. Let me read you the words again. In the resolution, violence and looting are unlawful, unacceptable, and contrary to the purpose of peaceful protest. So it's right there in the resolution. And so what other reason would any Republican senator object to the things in this resolution? If a senator objects, they should be asked, which of these things do they disagree with? Do they believe Americans do not have the constitutional right to exercise the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the right to petition their government? Do they believe Americans do not have the right to peacefully protest? Do they disagree with the statement that violence and looting are unlawful and unacceptable? Or do they support the President's use of tear gas against people, including families, who are peacefully protesting in a public park? Which is it? Any objector should explain why the simple resolution I offer today is so unacceptable to them. And so, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of a concurrent resolution expressing the sense of the Congress that the constitutional rights of Americans must be respected, that violence and looting are unlawful and unacceptable, and that Congress condemns the President for ordering federal officers to use gas and rubber bullets against peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. on June 1st, 2020. That the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
reserving the right to object. First and foremost, I'm a First Amendment absolutist. The right to peaceful protest is absolutely sacrosanct. It is a core American liberty. And when peaceful demonstrations occur within the bounds of the law and with respect for the needs of law enforcement, leadership at every level has an obligation to respect and honor them. Our nation must not turn a deaf ear to the anger, pain, or frustration of Black Americans. Our nation needs to hear them. There's no question that the killing of George Floyd was horrific. In my view, it absolutely appears to have been a heinous act of criminal violence. It is totally unacceptable that Mr. Floyd is dead. And there's no doubt that residual racism continues to be a stain on our country. We need to do more to address it. Over the last few days, we've seen peaceful protests hijacked on a nightly basis into a rolling series of riots that engulfed great American cities in wanton destruction and violent crime. These are the two issues the American people are focused on: justice for Black Americans in the face of unjust violence, and peace for our country in the face of looting, riots, and domestic terror. Those are the two issues that Americans want addressed: racial justice and ending riots. Unfortunately, this resolution from my friend, the Democratic leader, does not address either one of them. Instead, it just indulges in the myopic obsession with President Trump that has come to define the Democratic side of the aisle. It pays more attention to the precise ways that federal law enforcement protects presidential movements around the White House than to the fact that great American cities, including my colleague's beloved New York, have been consumed by rioting, looting, and violence against police for several nights in a row with no end in sight. Outside of Washington, D.C. bubble, there is no universe where Americans think Democrats' obsession with condemning President Trump is more urgent priority than ending the riots or advancing racial justice. There is no universe in which the dynamics of Lafayette Park before the president seeks to exit the White House is a more urgent national priority than the shattered glass, destroyed businesses, and brutal attacks on law enforcement that are happening nationwide in places like Lafayette Street in New York City. So I will object to my distinguished colleague's thin resolution and will offer something more full-throated in its place. My resolution would condemn a long pattern of unjust police violence toward Black Americans. It would champion the First Amendment and praise the peaceful protest that followed Mr. Floyd's death. And it would clearly condemn the violent rioting that has paralyzed places like New York City and insist that local authorities finally get serious about protecting the innocent. So I hope my distinguished colleague will not object. America is united in outrage at the death of Mr. Floyd, and I hope we can unite to condemn these senseless riots and move forward together as one nation. Therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of SRES 601, submitted earlier today. I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. It's very simple.
Democratic Leader.
It's very simple why the Republican leader objected to our resolution and offered this one instead. It's because they do not want to condemn what the president did, though every fair-minded American of any political party would. We certainly should condemn violence. Let me repeat, this resolution condemns violence. but it is insufficient in the light of what happened yesterday to just condemn violence and not condemn what the President did as well. So I will object to my colleague's resolution.
Objection is heard.